Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to episode 45 of the podcast, and I hope you guys are having a good week so far. I know I shouldn't say this because, the weather has been so nice lately, but I think I'm ready for fall. I try not to be one of those people that wishes like that this current season is over and we're going into the next one, but I don't know. Something about fall. It's like my favorite time of year, and it kind of, helps that my birthday is in September. But anyways, I hope you all are enjoying whatever weather you have, wherever you are. And I hope you guys are ready to dive in and discuss this mystery because it was an interesting one. So, the Moonstone Castle Mystery is the 40th book in the original Nancy Drew series, The Yellow Spines, and it was first written in 1963. So you all probably know this, but I love to start by talking about the Nancy Drew book covers, and if you ever want to see these, I post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. And I was actually able to find two separate covers for the Moonstone Castle Mystery. So for this first cover, and this is the one that I saw on my book growing up, but they definitely went with a bold color choice. They were like primary colors for everyone because Nancy's wearing a yellow dress, Bess is wearing a blue dress, and George is wearing red. And I don't know, maybe it's just the texture of their hair in this picture. I just feel like at least one bottle of hairspray was used per person, because it looks like it could hold up in a strong hurricane. What's that saying again? The stiffer the hair, the more likely you are to keep your hairstyle intact while solving mysteries. But there is like a yellow sunset in the background, and we see this castle with the door kind of halfway up and halfway down, and there's a moat around it, and I'm not gonna lie, it looks super cool. Or the drawbridge, I should say. We're talking about castles here, so that's a drawbridge. Now, the second cover, I've never seen this before. I found this on Google, and I was like, wow, I have to talk about this. Because this may be like a UK or a French version, but honestly, it's giving me He-Man vibes. There's a castle in the background, and this spooky-looking sky. It looks like Castle Grayskull. Like, I can picture He-Man standing on top of this and going, "By the power of Grayskull!" And then there's like this creepy old man who, he kind of looks like a statue because he's blue. He looks kind of interesting. And then Nancy has this red hair that kind of fades out to blonde at the ends. And there's a woman in a rocking chair. And George, Bess, and I don't know who that guy is behind them. But yeah, there's a lot going on this cover. So I came up with a funny cover spoof for the Moonstone Castle Mystery. And I cannot ever pass up an opportunity to put in a Monty Python reference. So I said, we've already got one, because I can just picture the French knight standing on top of this castle and being like, "Go away, I don't want to talk to you no more, you empty-headed animal food trough wiper. I fart in your general direction. Your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries." I could just picture Nancy being like, what a strange person. So for my cover rating for these covers, I gave them 3 magnifying glasses. They're pretty cool. I mean, maybe I would give the original cover like a higher rating. Maybe the other cover I would say like a 2 because it doesn't really look like Nancy. It looks like I don't know, someone with like really big 80s hair. And like, I know we're going to get that on the files, but I don't picture Nancy that way in the originals. So up next, we've got our cast of characters for this mystery, and there is a Mr. and Miss Bowen who are missionaries, Joni Horton / Jody Holt Armstrong. There was a grandmother Horton who was Joni's caregiver, Mr. and Miss Oman, their first names are Ben and Clara, Miss Thompson, the hotel owner, Miss Hempstead, the owner of the Brass Kettle Tea Room, Mr. Seaman / Ben Oman, and John Wheeler, who is the Hortons' attorney, Amy Cadmus / Art Munson, Peter Judd, who is an ex-train conductor, Jake Suggs, the bearded castle dweller, and Rudy Raspin. So I came up with a synopsis for this book, so I'll go ahead and read it. Nancy receives a strange unmarked package with a moonstone in it, telling her she will need it for good luck. A man follows her when she goes to the post office to investigate it, but he gets away. She is then told by Carson that he wants her help solving a mystery. 2 missionaries who were detained in Africa have come back only to discover their granddaughter in Deep River is missing. Nancy, Bess, and George go to Deep River, once called Moonstone Valley, and see a mysterious castle. They periodically investigate it while avoiding near mishaps like a fallen tree that almost lands on them and yet another boat crash. Nancy is able to piece together clues and find Joni Horton, aka Jody Holt Armstrong, uncover a gang who exploits elderly people, and restore Joni to her relatives and inheritance. You know, in the Nancy Drew universe, we love a good orphan who's restored to their family and inheritance plotline. Like, they use this in so many of the books. Like, I think as a kid, like, I knew that I wasn't an orphan, but I was like, maybe I have an inheritance out there somewhere. It seems pretty common in these books, so it gave me unrealistic expectations, just like Disney princesses and their hair. So I took down a lot of notes for the Moonstone Castle Mystery, so let's go ahead and discuss. Dang, I wasn't kidding. I just went to look, and I think I have like 5 or 6 pages of notes. I was like, where do these end? So prepare yourself. So the first thing that I wrote down is Nancy receives a package with no address or name on it. Suspicious. And then when she opens it up, there's a message made from cut out newspaper words. Like, I don't know. If I were to get mail like this, I would probably scream and throw it across the room, because like there's nothing good that comes from like ransom style notes. I mean, this makes me think of Stay Tuned for Danger. And in that computer game / book, Rick Arlen was getting death threats, so I'm just saying. But in a surprise twist, this person actually means us no harm. The message said, "This is for good luck from a well-wisher. You will need it within the next few weeks." And inside, there's a moonstone. Moonstones are really pretty. I was looking them up on Google, and they're white and iridescent looking. They almost look like fish scales, but they're super pretty. But George says, "Oh, a mystery for you to solve, the case of the unknown admirer." And Nancy comments, "It can't be from Ned because it's postmarked River Heights and Ned is away at camp." Can I just say, Ned goes to camp a lot in these books. He's always at some kind of camp doing some kind of counselor like duties. I don't know. It's just kind of funny. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to the post office to see where this package came from, and halfway there, Nancy gets this feeling that they might be followed. So she says, "Okay, I'm going to go on foot, and you guys follow me in the car." And sure enough, George and Bess see this man following Nancy, and so they chase him. So the suspicious guy gets away, and Nancy calls Chief McGinnis, and she gives him a description, and she says he was wearing a tan and brown plaid suit. He's thin, and he scowls. I really love when in the Nancy Drew books they give a facial expression as a descriptor. They'll be like, yeah, he looks like someone that had, his parade rained on or had his candy taken from him. It's like, well, he probably doesn't always look like that. I'm sure he smiles. So the next note that I took down is Nancy says her father has a case, and the Bowens, they are some missionaries. They went to Africa. They were captured by some local tribes. Okay. And then when they came home, Grandmother Horton, who they had left their granddaughter Joni in the care of, had died, and their granddaughter was missing. So Carson is trying to figure out what happened to Joni. Now, my next note that I took down has to do with Nancy's home decor in her house. So apparently there's a green and gray striped sofa in Nancy's living room. It's been a while since we've had a direct reference to the color of something in Nancy's house, so I took a note of it. So the next thing that I wrote down, George asks, weren't there any servants while they're discussing the case? They're trying to figure out if anyone else could have been around to know where Joni went, but I found this so indicative of Nancy's class. It's just assumed everyone has servants because that's the circle they all run in. And I actually received a really interesting comment on Instagram a few weeks ago about, wouldn't it have been interesting if Nancy had been, in a different class, like more middle or lower class, and she had a job, that she was trying to do alongside solving her mysteries. it definitely would have been more interesting, I think, and I think it probably would have limited where she could have gone. So I see why they made her middle to upper class, but I thought that was a cool point that person brought up. So my next note is Carson proposes that Nancy, Bess, and George help him in the case of tracking down Joni. He says, all your expenses will be paid by the Carson Drew law firm. I had to make a note of this because it's always implied that Carson is kind of putting Nancy up in all these places because, I mean, she doesn't have a job, and Carson is, a distinguished attorney in River Heights. So, I mean, mystery solving is sort of Nancy's job. I mean, I know she kind of makes that money, helps Carson make that money, but I thought it was funny that he outright said that. So it's at this point in the mystery, the guy that was following Nancy around to the post office followed her home. So Mr. Drew hired an officer to watch the house after he did that, and around midnight when Nancy has gone to sleep, she hears someone yelling stop, and then hears a shot pierce the night, and she calls for Carson, and there's no answer. Like my heart was in my throat. I knew Carson was probably okay, but that was intense, and apparently it was just a car backfiring. It wasn't even a gun, but there was a prowler who got away, and he was scowling, so he's that same guy who was frowning earlier. But Carson actually makes light of it and jokes about the situation, and he says, you thought your old dad had met his end, eh? So before Nancy, Bess, and George can go to Deep River to start solving the mystery and looking for Joni, they get a phone call from Mr. Bowen saying he got a phone call threatening harm to anyone trying to solve the mystery. So he's very worried about it and worried about Nancy's safety, but Nancy tells him not to worry, and as she drives off, Hannah says, nobody can threaten Nancy Drew and get away with it. It worries me, but I admire her courage. I thought it was kind of cute that Hannah had this kind of aside to herself, like just talking to herself. But I mean, she admires Nancy so much, but she is scared for her and wants her to be careful. Now, Nancy, Bess, and George see a castle when they get to Deep River, and it's a huge estate near their hotel. And the storm picks up and lightning hits a tree, which almost falls on them. And Nancy tells Miss Thompson about it, and she says the tree surgeon can fix it up. I had never heard that term before, like a tree doctor. Just like, I don't know, that to me sounds like way expensive, and I'm not good with plants, so yeah. Most of the plants I have need a doctor after I've taken care of them. Like the only thing I can keep alive are succulents, and that's because I only need to water them when I remember. Now, this next note is kind of cool and made me think of the computer game Danger on Deception Island, but there's a tea room in town called the Brass Kettle. Reminds me of the Hot Kettle in Danger on Deception Island. And as we're soon going to see, this is the place that everybody goes for the hot goss. It's like, okay, we want gossip, we go to the Brass Kettle. So Nancy and the girls go to the Brass Kettle, and they overhear a man asking about someone named Drew. So Nancy hides at the back table, and George follows the man, who gets away. And meanwhile, Bess and Nancy just decide, I don't know why they decide this, but George, is tailing this villain. And they're like, yeah, let's just sit down and eat dinner. And they don't even worry about George when she doesn't return. Like, it's a good 3 or 4 pages before they're like, where's George? And then the book says Bess was in tears. She and George had many little misunderstandings and sometimes found fault with each other, but the two girls were very close. The thought that George might be a prisoner was almost too much for Bess. Like, this was so heartwarming to me. The fact that George always treats Bess so horribly, she's always so mean to her, and Bess is like in tears and upset that her cousin is missing. So Nancy and Bess go back to the Brass Kettle Cafe, and they question Miss Hempstead, who is like this gossipy old lady that sits there all the time, about that man, Mr. Seaman. Unfortunate name. And she says, are you his girlfriend? He's a nice man, reliable like. That's the kind of man a girl ought to have for a husband. Blech. I find it so funny that in these books, whenever Nancy is like doing her hardcore detective work and she's inquiring about some suspicious looking man, the people always jump to the conclusion like, oh, do you want to date him? Are you guys in a relationship? It's like, no, it's complicated. I'm trying to figure out why he is chasing me or why he kidnapped my friend. Like, no, it's not like that. Also, most of the time, these men are way older than Nancy, Bess, and George, so it's even weirder. But it is funny, though, because Nancy tells Bess she wants to keep her identity a secret, so she goes by the name of Irene, and she speaks in a voice that's like 3 octaves higher than her normal speaking voice. And so, while they're talking to Miss Hempstead, Bess says, "Mr. Seaman really ought to reduce, though. Irene prefers thin men." I love that Bess is really trying to sell it here. So while Nancy and Bess are talking to Miss Hempstead, they learn that the castle that they saw from their hotel was abandoned, and tragedies happened during building it. Like, they say a child drowned in the moat, a man got hoisted on the drawbridge and crushed, and I was like, okay, wow, this is very gory. And they also learned that Deep River, the town, used to be called Moonstone Valley. So, Moonstone Valley, Nancy got a moonstone in the mail. It's all starting to connect here. So, they finish talking to her, and they eventually find George in a soda shop, and she's okay. She says once she got done tailing the man, another man tailed her, and so she snuck into the soda shop and lost him. Now, the next note that I have down is Nancy notices that the drawbridge is down to the castle, so they go to investigate it, but then it gets pulled up while they're there. So, Nancy determines they'll have to come back later. And Bess says that a dream boy at the motel asked her to play tennis, but she'll still go to the castle with them if they want her to. And of course, George teases her and says, "You just can't wait to get out on the court with that boy." But Nancy tells Bess to go play tennis with this guy, his name is Alan Ryder, to, quote, not blow their cover. And George teases he could be part of Mr. Seaman's gang, and it makes Bess mad. So Bess kind of spouts off at George, and she says, "George Fane, there are times when I could pull your hair right out by the roots." And you know what? I think that Bess is entitled to go back at George sometimes, because George is always going after her. So Bess goes on her tennis date, and Nancy and George swim across the moat, and they hear this ghostly voice say, "Swim back, death awaits you here," which, that's super creepy. So, of course, Nancy ignores the voice, and they investigate the castle, and someone leaves in a car while they're there, and George swears it looks like Mr. Seaman. So the pieces for this mystery are slowly kind of falling into place, but Nancy and George get this bright idea that they're going to put rocks on the drawbridge to keep it from going back up, and they get into this moral debate over it, and George insists it's okay because they're trying to catch crooks, but Nancy says, well, what if they aren't crooks? Like, my mouth fell open a little bit at that one. I'm like, Nancy, you're pretty sure that they're crooks because you're investigating them, but it's interesting because Nancy usually doesn't have moral dilemmas like this. She's usually just like, I'm gonna do it and ask questions later. So it was funny that, George was the one like, no, we're doing this. Now, the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy invites Ned and the guys to come and check out the hotel and kind of help them solve some of this mystery. And Bess says, "It's a good thing Alan is leaving tomorrow. I hate complications." Which I thought this was hilarious because Bess was getting on to Nancy in Clue of the Old Stagecoach, and she was like, "Nancy, what about Ned?" Because she was hanging out with that Rick Larrabee guy. And I'm like, Bess, this is no different. What about Dave? So the next thing to happen is Nancy's car gets stolen. She's gotten it stolen quite a few times lately, but Alan says maybe it wasn't really stolen, just borrowed. Like, what kind of logic is that? Borrowing without asking is stealing. So Nancy goes to the police about it, and then she is able to verify the license plate number of the car they saw driving away from the castle, which they thought Mr. Seaman was in, and it does belong to him. Dun dun dun. Okay, so you know how in the synopsis I mentioned that there was another boating accident? Well, Nancy and George get in a boat with Mr. Wheeler, the lawyer for the Moonstone estate, and he's 70, and it's dark, and he's a speed demon. Do you see where this is going? So they crash, then Nancy has to swim, and she's dragging this unconscious man to the shore, and they shout for help, and Nancy does SOS signals with a flashlight until help arrives. Like, that's a pretty cool skill to have, but you wouldn't have had to even used it if you hadn't gotten yourself into this situation. So one of the people that rescues them is named Amy, and she asks George about her name, and we get some interesting backstory on George's name. And so George says, "It's my real name. According to the story, my parents were so sure I was going to be a boy, they had picked out only the name George, so they decided to give it to me anyway." Boom, there you have it. So while the girls are riding back in the boat with Amy, she tells them about this girl who lives there locally, and her name is Jody Armstrong, and she was adopted. So Nancy starts to suspect that this could be Joni. And, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a jump logically. I mean, there's plenty of people who could have been adopted, but she says, well, Joni Horton, Jody Holt, they're similar enough names. I mean, fair enough. And usually that's how these books work out. So Nancy is just used to these kind of things falling in her lap. I mean, the coincidences are not just coincidences. So Nancy arranges to go visit Jody, but she isn't there, so they talk to her mom. And I love how Nancy is just like, we met so-and-so, and they said we should meet Jody, and we're staying in this motel and don't know anyone in town. Like, this would not fly today. People would be like, stranger danger, get away. Like, no. But since it's Nancy Drew and she's a trustworthy person, we just go with it. So the next note that I have down is Mr. Wheeler gets kidnapped by a man and woman from the hospital. So this poor man, he crashed that boat that him and George and Nancy were in, and then while he's up there recovering, these people just check him out of the hospital like he's a library book. I feel like you couldn't get away with this today. The next thing I have down is Nancy, Bess, and George go to the brass kettle again, and Miss Hempstead says, "Hello, Nancy Drew." So she got an anonymous note from someone saying to watch out for Nancy Drew, and the girls suspect that it was Mr. Seaman. So they're able to learn about an ex-train conductor from Mrs. Hempstead, and his name is Peter Judd, and Nancy suspects he was the man Mr. Wheeler was taking them to see when he crashed that boat. So they go meet him and they hear his story, and they find a man eavesdropping and have to chase him off. So they're pretty sure again that it was Mr. Seaman, but this ex-train conductor tells them this grand story about knowing this little girl named Joni. So they're trying to piece it together, and they're getting really close to finding this girl, they think. The next note that I took down is Bess and George are very eager to meet Jody, but Nancy says they should wait until she reaches out because she doesn't want to be a friendship pusher, which this made me laugh. This reminded me of the original Mean Girls. I'm a pusher, Katie. I'm a pusher. But I'm like, I guess there is this kind of social dance that you do when you're first making friends. Like, I don't know, you're like, I want to hang out with you, but I don't want to seem like too over eager, but then I also don't want to, I don't know, like for me it's like I want to hang out with people, but I don't want to extend an invitation and them turn it down because then I feel like rejected. I just want to be friends with people who love Nancy Drew, thrifting, coffee, and traveling. Is that too much to ask? So the next thing I have down is Nancy is looking at the castle through her binoculars and sees an unkempt man with a beard looking back at her and signaling. So this was so weird. I mean, it would be so weird to be looking at an abandoned estate and then at the end of your binoculars you see somebody and you're like, oh, there's somebody there. But Ned calls it wig-wagging, the signaling that this guy's done, and I've never heard that before. But apparently it just means, just signaling, waving. I learned something. But anyway, Ned rents a boat called the Water Witch, and they go out to see this sunken boat of Mr. Wheeler's because it's still just sitting there where he crashed it. And another boat comes barreling towards them, and the pilot jumps out, and Ned narrowly gets their boat out of its way. So yet another boat crisis averted, but Bert is able to jump on the other boat. So they get up next to it, and he gets over on it and gets control of it, but the police show up and they say, "So you're the ones who stole the boat." So you mean to tell me that this pilot jumped off this boat, had time to call the police and say, hey, this boat has been stolen or missing? I mean, maybe he did it before he got out on the water and was going to do this, but like the thought that went into this is pretty crazy. So they have to go to police headquarters and they say, you haven't proved that you didn't steal the boat. And then Nancy says, we have no proof, but also you have no proof we did steal the boat. Like, oh, dang, what do you got to say to that, officer? So the officer tells Nancy that she sounds like a lawyer, and she says, probably because I've learned that from my father, Carson Drew. And then the officer perks right up because he recognizes the name, and he says, Carson Drew? Everyone knows him. Why didn't you say so? Then he winks and says, case dismissed. Like, look at that Nancy Drew privilege, everybody. Like, can we all get some of that? So Nancy Drew avoids prosecution by the law, and everyone goes over to investigate the castle together, and then Nancy goes missing. So apparently that bearded guy that she saw with her binoculars came out of a hidden room off the stairwell, put a vial under her nose, and pulled her in there, which is ugh. So everyone rescues her. The man refuses to talk, and they take him to the police. And Nancy finds where the man has been living in a turret and finds a note that says, "Moonstone Valley is our password." And the police find a note on the man that just says "Wolf's Eye." I'm sorry, but how dumb do you have to be to put "this is our password" after the word? Like, no. Like, the first step to being a good villain is to memorize the password so you don't have to write it down. So it's at this point in the story when Nancy and the rest of the gang go to Jody Armstrong's picnic. They weren't friendship pushers and they waited the right amount of time. So she shows Nancy pictures of herself as a kid. And I said, I don't know, does anyone else find this creepy? Because I wouldn't show someone I just met my baby pictures. Like, first of all, that's weird. Second of all, I'm pretty sure they don't want to see that. And third, no. But Jody is just perfectly content with being like, here I am at 5 years old, here I am at 8 years old. But anyway, Nancy is able to get a picture. She actually takes a picture of Jody's too. So not only is she looking at her baby pictures, but she steals one, which is kind of borderline, no. Not right. So, but she is able to confirm that Joni and Jody are the same person. So, yay. I do find it funny, though, that the person that was questioning the morality about putting rocks on a drawbridge sees no problem whatsoever in stealing someone's baby picture. So, the police contact Nancy and they say the bearded castle dweller has talked, and his name is Jake Suggs, and he says he won't be responsible for a murder. So at this point they're like, what is he talking about? Like, did he kill somebody in that castle? Well, the police find Mr. Wheeler in the cellar. So he was kidnapped from the hospital and left in the cellar, and a couple brought him to Jake and paid him to watch him. So thankfully, Mr. Wheeler is okay. And Nancy finally finds her car at this point too. It was hidden in some kind of root cellar on the castle's island. So she, Bess, and George are driving it over the drawbridge, and then the drawbridge starts to go up on them. So they panic. Bess is screaming. Nancy throws the car in reverse, and then they're stuck in there. So Nancy and George have to figure out how to get the drawbridge back down. So they climb over, and they're able to hold each other up and fix it enough to make it go back down. The next note that I wrote down is Nancy gets a lead about a Miss Wilson. So she hears this I believe at the Brass Kettle Cafe. So the girls go out to the property, and Nancy overhears that a gang is scamming her out of money like they did to Miss Horton years ago. And Clara and Ben Oman are their names, and Nancy determines Ben is also Mr. Seaman, and there is a Rudy Raspin who is the Scowling Man. Once again, we have these horrible villains who want to extort elderly people. That really burns me. But Nancy also overhears that Ben is missing his moonstone, so she figures out the moonstone that was sent to her in the mail belongs to Ben Oman / Mr. Seaman. So Nancy gets a message at the hotel telling her to leave the moonstone under a bush. So Nancy does, and she catches the person coming for it, a Celia Smith, who was apparently a maid for Aunt Eloise. I was like, this is a plot twist, because it says Nancy recognized the person, so I was like, who could that possibly be? But apparently she's also married to Rudy Raspin, and the Omans used their own daughter and claimed that she was Joni so they could get her inheritance. So in the end, it all ties up. But the wolf's eye that was mentioned on the piece of paper that was on Jake Suggs, the bearded guy from the castle, it just ends up being another name for Moonstone in the end. So they drop that on you, and then they drop this bomb at the very end of the book. They say Grandma Horton was underfed and sedated when she died. And that's just awful. I hated that they just threw that in. It was a little bit like the witch tree symbol when they were like, all these people just fell in this hole and they were never found or seen or heard from again. But in the end, Joni/Jody is reunited with her grandparents and gets her inheritance. So that is the conclusion for all of my notes, and What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen is a bit shorter for this episode. The only mentioning that we get of Hannah's cooking is hot cocoa and angel cake, but that still sounds really, really good. Now for the add that to your resume section, I said Nancy is a SOS flashlight signaler because she knew to do that, which was really, really cool. And she's a drawbridge mechanic. Between her and George, they fixed it. Now let's discuss the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the Moonstone Castle Mystery. So I liked the fact that there were some twists in this book. I was really not expecting a maid of Aunt Eloise's to play such a crucial part in this mystery, because if she hadn't sent Nancy that moonstone, like, that kind of set everything up. So that was cool. And Nancy and the girls kind of got to enjoy themselves on vacation. I mean, Bess got to play tennis with a cute guy. So now the things I didn't like the elderly abuse, because I never like that. But I also didn't like that creepy man sedating Nancy and dragging her into a closet. So I gave the Moonstone Castle Mystery a 3 magnifying glasses rating. It was a pretty good book. It wasn't like a favorite, but it was pretty good, and it was entertaining, and there were quite a few twists. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the clue of the whistling bagpipes. So if you like Scotland and Nancy learning to play the bagpipes, you won't want to miss this one. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.